No one crosses the military checkpoints in Sagan carrying antibiotics hidden among sacks of rice. No one can fool the soldiers who inspect every vehicle, every load, every person with suspicious eyes. And yet, on that July morning in 2023, a man appeared on foot in the displaced persons camp on the outskirts of Calais, as if the war did not exist. I was kneeling beside my daughter, pressing a damp cloth against her hot forehead. 3 nights had passed since the fever began to consume little Jin Mio, who had barely turned 1. I couldn't sleep, and each of her breaths felt like tearing me apart inside. Her cracked lips murmured meaningless words, and her skin burned so intensely that I feared she would simply disappear in my arms. The other Christian women in the camp prayed with me until their voices were weary. We wept, pleaded, shouted in whispers, begging God that the soldiers wouldn't hear. There were no medicines, no doctors, only our hands outstretched to the sky, imploring that someone, somewhere, would see us. Then I heard footsteps. At first, I thought they were soldiers. My heart raced. We were constantly surrounded by patrols, always looking for any pretext to punish or take someone away. But these footsteps were different, soft, almost reverent. I looked up and saw his silhouette outlined by the waning moon. A thin man, about 40 years old, wearing peasant clothes covered in red dust, carrying a sack of rice on his shoulder. There was a calmness in his eyes that seemed impossible for someone who had just crossed hostile territory. He approached, and in a gentle voice said, "The Lord sent me." I didn't ask how he knew my name. I didn't ask how I had arrived there without being stopped. Deep down, I just knew. There was an answer from God, something that transcended human logic. The man placed the bag on the ground, and with steady hands despite the trembling, moved the rice aside and removed a small sealed plastic bag. Inside were bottles of antibiotics, antipyretics, rehydration solution, and other medications, more valuable than gold to someone like my daughter on the verge of collapse. "For your little girl," he said. 3 days. Give this to her every 8 hours. Don't miss a dose." My hands trembled so much I almost dropped the bottle. Tears blurred my vision, but I could see the man smile, with a tenderness beyond comprehension. It wasn't a hero's smile. It was the smile of someone who knows he's being used by something much bigger than himself. How did you get through the checkpoints?" I managed to ask between sobs. He first looked at the distant mountains and then turned his gaze back to me. "I don't know," he replied humbly. "I passed by 3 military posts. At each one, the soldiers looked away as I passed, as if an invisible hand covered their eyes. I have no other explanation." The women who had prayed with me drew near in silence, forming a circle around Jin Mio. Some wept, others could barely breathe with emotion. We all knew we were witnessing something that defied all human logic. For the first time in days, I felt hope. I administered the first dose to my daughter, and in her feverish gaze, I saw the breath of life returning. At that moment, I understood that miracles still happen, and that God, in mysterious and perfect ways, continues to send help exactly when and where we need it most. With trembling hands, I swallowed hard, but I also swallowed the missionary's presence, because that was exactly what he represented, a bridge between heaven and us. He stayed with us for another hour, praying in such a low voice that the night wind seemed to try to carry his words away. When he finally stood up, he picked up his empty bag and disappeared into the shadows before dawn. I never learned his full name, nor which village he came from, nor how he managed to return to India without being captured. But 3 days later, my daughter opened her eyes without a fever, gave a shy smile and said, "Mom, I'm hungry." Those 3 words changed everything in the camp. If God could send an invisible man through military checkpoints with medicine hidden in sacks of rice, then nothing was beyond his reach. Not even us, forgotten refugees in a dusty corner of Myanmar, where the world seemed to have turned its back on us. To understand the impact of this miracle, I need to take you back to the beginning, to my village in Sagaing, to the place where life still seemed simple and faith, a precious secret that no one dared reveal. My village was called Tambo, a cluster of wooden and bamboo houses scattered among rice paddies that gleamed like green mirrors under the morning sun. We were about 30 kilometers west of Monigua, far enough away to be ignored by modernity, but close enough to sell our harvest at the market every 2 weeks. I was born there, I got married there, and I always imagined I would grow old there, watching my children grow up among the same furrows of earth that my grandmother had tended decades before. My husband, Kotin Maung, was a man of few words, but with tireless hands. Every morning, I would find him in the fields, checking the irrigation canals, talking to the buffalo as if they were old friends. We had 3 children, Kiao, the eldest, 12 years old, serious and protective like his father, Tita, 9, with a laugh so loud it scared the crows. And my little Kinmio, 6 years old, who ran through the rice paddies chasing butterflies, always curious if Jesus also loved birds. Life was simple. There was no constant electricity, nor running water, but we had enough. In the morning, I ground rice in the stone mortar while Tita fed the chickens. He also helped his father mend fishing nets in the Chindwin River, which meandered about 2 kilometers from our house. Kinmio played with dolls made of corn husks, and together we invented songs without melody, but full of emotion. But there was something we did in secret, something that set us apart from many other families in the village. Every Sunday at sunset, we would gather in a small hut hidden among tamarind trees on the outskirts of Tambo. We were about 15 Christian families, perhaps 20 if you count the children. The hut was so small that we had to huddle together on the straw mats, knees touching each other. Our treasures were simple: photocopied Bibles that Pastor Sawin brought every month from Mandalay, hidden at the bottom of his seed bag. Sawin wasn't formally ordained. He was a farmer like us, but he had secretly studied with missionaries for years, learning the word of God to share it with those who needed it, without fear, in silence and faith. He had a soft yet firm voice, and when he read the scriptures, his words fell upon us like rain on dry land. He taught us to pray in a low voice, to sing hymns without instruments, without drums or guitars that would draw attention, simply to love God in quiet, in the shadows. Faith doesn't need stone temples, he always said. It only needs willing hearts. Sunday afternoons in the cabin were like little sanctuaries outside of time. The smell of damp wood, the constant buzzing of mosquitoes, the trembling voices of the elderly women praying with their eyes closed, tears streaming down their wrinkled faces. I felt Kotin Maung's hand squeezing mine each time we sang about God's grace. My children grew up knowing that our faith was a precious and dangerous treasure. I never openly told them we were taking risks, but they sensed it. From the way we walked to the cabin along hidden trails, from how we kept pages of the Bible in tea tins, from the silence that enveloped us like a cloak when we returned home. Once, Jin Mio, with her large black eyes fixed on mine, asked me, "Mom, why can't we tell everyone about Jesus?" I didn't know what to answer. I stroked her hair and simply said, "One day you will be able to, my love. Someday." But that day never came. Last April, everything changed. At first, they were just rumors. Men who had traveled to Monigua returned with disturbing stories. Villages burned in Yin Ma Bin, mass arrests in Kambalu, Christian leaders disappearing into the silence of the night. They said the military was hunting insurgents, but we all knew that insurgent was just a word used to persecute those who didn't kneel before them. Pastor Sawin warned us to be extra cautious. Our meetings went from weekly to bi-weekly, and then monthly. Some neighbors stopped coming, others moved to distant cities, trying to lose themselves in urban anonymity. We, however, remained. Kotin Maung believed that abandoning the land was abandoning God's blessing. I believed in the community, in those 15 families who were more than neighbors. They were brothers and sisters. We thought that if we remained discreet and silent, invisible, the storm would pass. But we were wrong. One afternoon in June, while Tita and I were washing clothes in the irrigation canal, we heard the distant roar of engines. We looked north and saw columns of black smoke rising from the villages of Kinyu and Tabayan. The wind carried the smell of burning, not of campfires, but of something far more sinister. "Mom, what is this?" Tita asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, darling," I replied, lying, but I knew exactly. It was the smell of houses on fire, of lives destroyed, of war approaching like a hungry predator. That night, Kotin Maung and I stayed awake in the dark, listening to the crickets and the distant echo of explosions that rumbled like untimely thunder. He took my hand and said softly, "If they come here, I want you to grab the children and run into the forest. Don't look back. Don't wait for me." "Don't say that," I whispered, my throat tightening. "Turn me around, Nan." I couldn't promise anything. I just clung to him, silently pleading, feeling God's presence holding us as the darkness of night and the fear of war enveloped us. That moment would never come. But God, in his infinite mystery, sometimes allows the storm to reach us, not because he has abandoned us, but because it is in the fire that we learn the depth of our roots, and ours were about to be torn out. On the night they took Kotin Maung, the stars shone with a cruel clarity, as if the sky had washed its hands of what was to come. 2 weeks had passed since we saw the smoke on the horizon, 2 weeks of tense silence in the village. Every bark of a dog startled us, every distant engine quickened our hearts. Shepherd Sawin had disappeared without a trace. Some said he had fled to India, others whispered that he had been imprisoned in Manigua. No one knew, and the uncertainty corroded our souls like rust. That afternoon, Koden Maung returned early from the fields. His face was more serious than usual, his lips pressed into a thin line. He sat on the steps of our house and called the children. "I want you to listen carefully," he said, looking Aunia in the eyes. "If anything happens to me, you're the man of this family. Take care of your mother and your sisters. Understand?" Kia, only 12 years old, nodded with a solemnity that shouldn't exist in a child. Tita approached and hugged her father without saying a word. Jin Mio, still too young to understand the gravity of the moment, asked, "Dad, are you going somewhere?" He picked her up and pressed her against his chest. "No, my little butterfly. I just want you to know that I love you." I watched from the kitchen, my hands submerged in water as I washed the rice. Something in his tone chilled me to the bone. It was the voice of a man making peace with the inevitable. "Kotin Maung," I called as the children went to play. "What happened?" He didn't look at me. He just stared at the dirt road that snaked towards the village. "Today at the market, I heard they're looking for names. Someone betrayed the Christian families of Tambo." The words fell upon us like stones in a lake, creating waves of panic that washed over me. Who? Who betrayed us? It doesn't matter. What matters is that they are coming. "Then let's go," she said desperately. "Tonight we'll pack the essentials and cross the forest." But he interrupted me, holding my rough, calloused hands in his. "If we all run away together, they'll catch us along the way. But if I stay, if I give them a reason to stop here, maybe you'll have time." "No, no, no," I repeated, feeling the world spin beneath my feet. "I won't leave you. You won't leave me. You will obey me." His eyes, normally so calm, burned with a fierce determination. It was the look of someone who had already made his decision, who had already surrendered his life to hands that weren't mine. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand that he choose survival over sacrifice, but I knew that asking that would be asking him to stop being who he was. And at that moment, I realized I had fallen in love with that man precisely because of his unwavering integrity. We ate dinner in silence that night, rice with dried fish. Tita barely touched her food. Kiao chewed mechanically, her jaw closed, her eyes fixed on some invisible point. Quinn Mio chattered about a dragonfly she'd seen in the rice paddy, completely oblivious to the knot that was suffocating us all. After putting the children to bed, Koten Maung and I sat outside under the mango tree his grandfather had planted decades before. He hugged me, and I rested my head on his shoulder, memorizing the rhythm of his breathing, the smell of earth, and the pure sweat of his skin. "If I survive this," he said softly, "I'll find you. No matter where you are, I'll find you." "What if I can't find it?" I began, but my voice cracked. "If you don't find it, know that I gave my life for something worthwhile, for you, for the faith that has sustained us all these years." I wept silently, soaking his shirt with tears that tasted of farewell. Then, the trucks arrived. After midnight, the roar of the engines tore through the silence like knives. Bright lights swept across the village. Shouts in Burmese cut through the air. I heard knocking on doors, women crying, brutal orders that needed no translation. Koten Maung remained calm. He put on his best shirt, the one he saved for special occasions, and looked at me one last time. "Take the children to the back of the forest. Now." I clung to his arm, pleading. He kissed my forehead, then my lips, imprinting his love on my skin forever. "I love you, Nan. Never doubt that." Then he went out the front door, head held high. I ran to the children's room, covering their mouths before they could scream. Aunia picked up my son while I carried Tita. We went out the back window barefoot, wearing only the clothes on our backs. Behind us, I heard Koten Maung speak firmly. "I am a Christian. I am the one you are looking for. There is no one else here." And then, the sound of rifle butts hitting flesh. A scream. Drowning in panic, I dragged myself along the trail, each step tearing a piece of my soul away. Aunia ran ahead with Quinmio silently crying on her shoulder. Tita clung to my neck, trembling. When we reached the edge of the forest, I looked one last time. Flames licked the walls of our house, soldiers dragged bodies toward the trucks. Tambo, my lifelong home, was turning into an orange inferno under the lightning. Starry night. Amidst the chaos, I could hear, or perhaps only imagine, my husband's voice singing a hymn, weak but firm, defiant, until his last breath. Have you ever had to choose between staying or protecting someone you love? That soul-wrenching decision? If you've been through something like that, you know the pain that leaves invisible scars. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Even with Kiao pulling my arm. "Mom, we have to go now." I swallowed the scream that threatened to tear my throat and plunged into the darkness of the forest with my 3 children, the only wealth I had left in this world. Behind us, the fire burned. Ahead, there was only darkness and the ghostly echo of a promise. I will find you, no matter where you are. But Kotin Maung never found me. That night, the soldiers took 15 men from our village. None of them ever returned. The forest swallowed us like a hungry beast. The first few meters were chaos. Low branches whipped our faces. Treacherous roots threatened to topple us. Quinmio was crying convulsively, and each sob tore me apart, but I couldn't stop to comfort her. Every second we lost was a second the soldiers gained. Kiao led the way, guided more by instinct than by knowledge of the terrain. At 12 years old, he hunted rabbits with his father at the edge of the forest, but he had never ventured so deep. Even so, he did not hesitate. I carried Kinmio with a strength that didn't seem human. I gritted my teeth at every contortion or whimper from her. Tita ran beside me, gripping my hand so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. She didn't complain once. Her panting breath accompanied determined steps, blindly trusting that I knew where we were going. I didn't. I only knew that we needed to escape the flames, the smell of smoke that haunted us like an accusing ghost. We ran until our lungs burned, until Jinmio lost her voice from crying so much, until the darkness of the forest became so dense that we could barely distinguish our own hands. Finally, Aonia stopped beside a fallen tree, covered in moss and bioluminescent fungi that cast a faint glow in the twilight. I can't go on, she whispered, carefully placing Jinmio on the ground. I collapsed beside her, my heart pounding against my ribs as if it wanted to escape. Tita huddled against me, trembling. I didn't know if it was from the cold of the night or from the terror that had haunted us all the way there. Mommy, whispered Jinmio, her enormous eyes wide. Where's Daddy? The question hit me like a spear. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How could I explain to a 6-year-old that their father had just surrendered so that we could live? Kia spoke for me. Dad is fine, she lied, trying to sound firm, but her voice was choked with emotion. Kinmio nodded, wanting to believe, resting her head in my lap. Tita said nothing. She was mature enough to understand that some lies are acts of mercy. We spent the night there, huddled under the fallen tree, listening to the forest awaken around us. Cicadas sang in metallic symphonies, owls hooted in the distance. Some large animal broke branches in the undergrowth, but never came closer. Every noise put us on alert. Every creak could be a soldier, every shadow, a threat. Dawn arrived without anyone finding us, painting the sky pink and orange through the treetops. We have to keep going, he said, forcing me to stand, even though every muscle protested. Where to? Kiao asked, his eyes waiting for answers I didn't have. I remembered the whispered conversations among the men of the village. There was a camp for displaced people near Calais, to the north. Organizations provided food and temporary shelter. It wasn't much, but it was some hope. To the north, towards Calais. How much longer? Saida asked, rubbing her injured feet, bruised by the rough ground. 3 days, maybe 4, she replied, even without being sure. It could be 5, maybe 10, but she needed to give them hope, even if it was just a faint flame in the darkness. We walked for hours on end, under the sun that streamed through the treetops. Hunger began to gnaw at our stomachs, and Jinmio complained of thirst. All I could offer were a few sips of murky water from a stream we had found that morning. Kia tried to find fruit among the bushes, but only found bitter berries that almost made us vomit. On the second day, the forest began to change. The trees receded, giving way to thorny bushes and hot rocks that burned our bare feet. The sun beat down on our heads, and the gorge seemed to close with every step. And then, we heard the roar of engines, trucks. My heart raced. Kiao looked at me, eyes wide. They're coming? He whispered. I didn't know what to answer. I just pushed the children behind some rocks covered in vines, holding Sita and Kinmio against my chest and covering their mouths with my... Kiao crouched beside me, fists clenched, ready to fight. I had no weapon, only my tired body, and a courage that seemed not to belong to me. The truck sped past, kicking up dust less than 50 meters from us. Soldiers sat in the back, rifles slung over their shoulders, some smoking, gazing distractedly into the woods. I held my breath until they disappeared around the next bend. Only then did I allow myself to exhale. My legs trembled. They almost saw us, Tita whispered, her voice trembling. I kissed her head and murmured, God protected us. On the third day, Kinmio stopped walking. She collapsed in the middle of the road, her eyes glazed over, her body burning with fever. I picked up my daughter, feeling the heat emanating from her like an oven. Mommy, I can't carry her anymore, Tita said, tears streaming down her face. Don't apologize. I replied, struggling to remain calm. I'll carry her. I tied Kinmio to my back with my shawl, and each step felt like it was tearing at my legs and back, but I couldn't stop. To stop would mean giving up, and giving up meant that Koten Maung's sacrifice would have been in vain. That night, we camped beside a stream. I soaked a cloth in the cold water and placed it on Kinmio's forehead, silently praying for her fever to break. She murmured names and nonsensical phrases, calling for her father, speaking to invisible people. Meanwhile, Tita and Kiao fell asleep in each other's arms, too exhausted to resist, and I stayed there, feeling the weight of the world and the fragility of life in my arms. I stayed awake all night watching Kinmio's irregular, tense, and labored breathing, wondering if God was truly guiding us or if we were simply walking towards destruction. When the fourth day dawned, we saw lights in the distance. They blinked faintly, flickering like artificial fireflies. Kiao pointed with a trembling finger. "Is it there, Mom?" I asked myself, hope choking my chest. It has to be. I gathered the last of my strength and picked Kinmio up again. Tita leaned on me, limping, her feet covered in blisters, but she kept going. Each step was a battle, but there was no choice. We crossed one last low hill, and before us stretched the camp, a sea of blue tarps and makeshift shelters scattered across a dusty valley. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, all fleeing the same nightmare. When we reached the edge of the camp, my legs finally gave way. I fell to my knees, holding Kinmio against my chest. Tita collapsed beside me, sobbing with relief. Kiao knelt before me and rested his forehead against mine. "We did it, Mother." "Yes," I whispered, feeling a strange weight in my heart. Doing it was only the beginning. Kinmio burned with fever in my arms, and in that instant, I realized that our suffering was far from over. The displaced persons camp near Calais was not a refuge. It was a limbo of mud and despair. Hope there was rationed, like the murky water we drank every day. We were given a tiny space, 3 square meters, under a torn blue tarp, shared with another family. An elderly widow, Dee King, and her granddaughter May had arrived 2 weeks earlier, fleeing Kambaloo after their church was burned down with 7 people inside. May didn't speak. She only stared into the emptiness with eyes already weary of so much suffering. Our home was a patch of compacted earth where we spread out straw mats to sleep on. When it rained, and it rained almost every day, the water seeped through the tarp, soaking us. The smell was unbearable. Overflowing latrines, unwashed bodies, spoiled food under the scorching sun. There were more than 3,000 people in that forgotten valley, entire families crammed together, children with swollen bellies, elderly people coughing up blood, with nowhere to go. We fled one violence, only to encounter another. A different world, cruel in a silent way. Indifference, scarcity, the slow erosion of human dignity. Every morning we formed endless lines to receive a handful of cooked rice, and, if we were lucky, some lentils. Children cried from hunger. Mothers cried from helplessness. Men wandered aimlessly, trying to find work that didn't exist, trying to recover a dignity that had evaporated. Even Kiao joined the line at the only working communal tap, waiting for hours, while I prayed softly, asking God for strength and protection so we could continue living another day. Under the scorching sun, he carried a plastic jug that, when full, weighed almost his own weight. Often he returned empty-handed because the water ran out before it was his turn. His jaw clenched, fighting back tears he refused to let fall. Tita helped Doan collect dry firewood from the nearby bushes, despite the constant danger. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter of the camp, and any deviation could result in interrogation, beatings, or worse. One afternoon, Sita returned with a dark bruise on her arm. "What happened?" I asked, feeling a mixture of fury and fear tighten in my chest. "A soldier pushed me," she replied, trying to sound brave. "He said I shouldn't be there, but I picked up the firewood." I hugged my daughter, swallowing the impotent rage that threatened to overwhelm me. I wanted to protect them all, but in that place, protection was a luxury we couldn't afford. What broke my heart the most, however, was Kinmio, my little butterfly. She used to run through the rice paddies, chasing insects, laughing, alive and full of energy. Now she lay motionless under the tarp, consumed by a fever that wouldn't subside, no matter what I did. Her skin burned like embers, her lips cracked and bled. When she opened her eyes, she looked at me without recognizing me, calling me by names that weren't mine. "Grandma, Grandma, I'm cold," she murmured, even though she was sweating as if she were under an oven. I held her close to my chest, wetting cloths with warm water to place on her forehead, neck, and thin wrists, but nothing seemed to help. Desperate, I sought medical help at the camp. I searched the place until I found a man who said he had been a paramedic before the war. His hands were dirty, his breath smelled of cheap alcohol, but he was the only option. He examined Kin Mio with professional coldness, lifting her eyelids and checking her pulse. Infection, he diagnosed. She needs antibiotics, amoxicillin at least. Where can I get it? I asked, clinging to any thread of hope. He looked at me with pity. There are no medicines here. Aspirin is hard to find. If I had any, I would give it to your daughter first. He stood up to leave, but I grabbed his arm. Please, tell me what to do. He sighed, looking at me with a pity that hurt more than any blow. Pray. That's all that's left. And that's what I did. I prayed until I lost my voice, until my hands tingled from the effort. I whispered so the nearby soldiers wouldn't hear. I clenched my hands so tightly that my nails marked my palms, drawing bloody crescents. D. King approached, followed by May, the mute granddaughter, whose lips moved in silent prayer. Other women from the camp, Christians who recognized each other by knowing glances, joined us as night fell. We formed a desperate circle of faith around my daughter. We had no Bibles, no hymns, only our choked voices and a God who seemed distant, but in whom we dared to believe. Lord, Dakin prayed, his voice trembling, you who resurrected Jairus' daughter, who healed the widow's son, look upon this girl. Don't let the darkness take her, Father, whispered another woman, tears streaming down her face. You know the pain of losing a child. Have mercy on this mother. I couldn't utter a single word. Kin Mio, delirious, repeated the name of Jesus, as if it were the last buoy in a stormy sea, clinging to him with all the strength of her small life. If you have ever cried out to God in the darkest night, when everything around you seemed lost, you know exactly what that mixture of despair and pure hope is like. I felt each second weigh like an eternity. Her breath became labored, her voice broken, with pauses that paralyzed my heart. No, 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 I groaned, hugging her against my burning chest, begging them not to take her. Kiao wept silently, huddled in a corner, his fists clenched, while Tita, exhausted, slept beside May. The whole world was reduced to that tiny space, 3 square meters where my daughter's life hung by an invisible thread. At midnight, her body convulsed in spasms. I screamed, and the women rushed over, holding her arms, whispering words of comfort and strength. Dao King began to chant an ancient hymn, one that spoke of dark valleys and canes of comfort, a broken melody, yet full of hope, which was soon joined by the voices of the other women. The music rose, timid but firm, toward the starry sky. In the middle of the chant, Kin Mio stood still. I pressed my ear to her chest, feeling a weak, irregular heartbeat, but still there. Her breathing was so shallow it barely moved the air. She's losing strength, Doan said, her voice choked with fear. We have to keep praying, I murmured to myself, even though I was exhausted. All my words, all my tears, all the faith I could muster seemed to have vanished. Only an immense emptiness remained in my chest, where there had once been hope. I lay down beside my daughter, hugging her tightly, etching every detail of her face into my memory. I whispered, forgive me for not being able to save her. The women continued to pray, forming a silent and steadfast network of faith around us. The camp was silent, the soldiers patrolling at a distance, oblivious to the drama unfolding beneath the torn canvas. Then, as the first light of dawn began to brighten the sky, I heard footsteps. My body stiffened, ready for the worst. But the footsteps were different, soft, almost reverent. I looked and saw a thin man, about 40 years old, wearing simple peasant clothes, stained with red dust. He walked along the road carrying a sack of rice on his right shoulder. Even in the twilight of dawn, his eyes conveyed a calmness that seemed impossible for someone who had just crossed hostile terrain. The women stopped praying, and the silence became heavy, expectant. He approached slowly, as if not wanting to frighten a wounded creature, and knelt beside me. The sack of rice fell to the ground with a thud, raising a cloud of dust, and at that instant, I felt that something miraculous was about to happen. Her words were whispers of power, weaving a prayer that seemed to touch every still fragile thread of life in Kin Mio. The girl trembled, but something changed in her body. A faint calm began to spread through her tense muscles, as if the warmth of faith had replaced the fire of fever. I felt each beat of her heart with a mixture of fear and relief, holding her thin hands between mine, feeling the strength of a hope I thought lost. The women around us continued praying, forming an invisible circle of faith, as if each word, each sigh, could reinforce Kin Mio's very existence. Even May, who rarely spoke, murmured something inaudible, as if silently but firmly pleading with God. After what seemed like an eternity, the fever began to subside. Kinmyo's cracked lips lost some of their feverish dark color. Her once burning skin became merely warm. She sighed deeply, almost unconsciously, and opened her eyes. This time, finally, she recognized me. A fragile but genuine smile appeared on her face. "Mom," she murmured, her voice hoarse and trembling, but full of life. I wept with relief and gratitude, embracing her as if I could never let her go. The man kneeling beside us finished his prayer, gently placed his hands on my head, and without a word, stood up. Before disappearing down the dusty road, he looked at us with a serenity that seemed to touch his very soul. I knew he was not just a man. He was the visible hand of God in the darkness. That day, amidst the dust of the camp and the pain that still surrounded us, we learned something no one could take away from us. Hope is a real force, and true faith is not limited to words. It acts, saves, and transforms. Kinmyo began to recover slowly, but her life was no longer just about survival. It was a testament to divine intervention, to the promise that is fulfilled even in the darkest valleys. I held her hand, feeling the delicate strength returning to her fingers. "Yes, my love, let's pray for them," I replied, trying to hold back tears. The other women from the camp approached, some bringing warm water to wash the girl's face, others simply kneeling in silence, joining us in gratitude. The air, once suffocating and heavy with fear and illness, seemed a little lighter. Faith had left its tangible mark on that space. In the following days, we administered each dose of antibiotic religiously. The fever began to subside completely, her breathing normalized, and Kinmyo's shy smile slowly returned to her face. Every gesture of hers was a victory. The simple act of drinking water, sitting up, trying to swallow food, became a daily miracle before our eyes. Tita and Kiao laughed again, though shyly, still marked by exhaustion. The miracle we witnessed wasn't limited to our family. Kinmyo's story spread through the camp like a faint light piercing the darkness. Others began to approach, to listen, to share their own prayers and hopes. The atmosphere, once heavy with despair, gained a breath of life and collective faith. Every gesture of care, every whispered prayer, became a bridge of humanity between those who had been forgotten by the world. And even as the soldiers passed by and the endless lines of survivors continued, there was something different in the air. The impossible had happened before us. God, in some mysterious way, had transformed our despair into living hope. Kinmyo was still weak, but she was breathing, and each breath was a reminder that faith does not fail, even in the darkest valleys. At that moment, I realized that our journey was not over. There was still suffering, still hunger and pain, but now there was also the certainty that we were not walking alone. And so, with my daughter in my arms and renewed faith in my heart, I looked at the camp and said in a low but firm voice, "We are not alone. God is with us." These words, simple, yet full of power, spread quickly through the camp. The women who had joined me in prayer ran to tell the others. Before long, small groups began to approach our tent. They weren't asking for anything. They just wanted to see with their own eyes that little girl who had been on the brink of death and was now begging for food with a strength that could only come from God. "It's a miracle," they whispered. "If he did this for this child, he can do it for us too." That night, for the first time since we arrived, I heard voices singing. They were low, almost timid hymns, but full of faith, echoing from different tents. Each note seemed to defy the silence and desolation that dominated the camp. And curiously, the soldiers on patrol seemed to ignore those chants, or perhaps they had seen them, but something prevented them from intervening. I pressed my daughter to my chest, feeling her heart beat strongly, and a profound certainty enveloped me. We were witnessing something that surpassed any human explanation. A man had crossed impossible checkpoints bringing medicine. A girl had returned from the brink of death. And suddenly, hope had returned to this forgotten place. Kinmyo's recovery did not go unnoticed. In a camp where despair was constant, news of her survival spread like wildfire. The women who had prayed with me couldn't keep quiet. They told other families, and those families told more people, until the story circulated throughout the camp, creating a silent but powerful current of hope. On the 4th day after the missionary's visit, a woman named Lala approached our tent. She held the hand of her 8-year-old son, a thin boy with sunken eyes, as if he hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Sister Nan knelt before me and asked in a choked voice, "Is it true? Did God really heal your daughter?" I nodded, looking at Kinmyo sitting beside me, still frail but alive. Lala's voice trembled. "Can we pray together today?" As the sun began to set, we gathered under Dane's tarp. At first, there were only 10 of us women, but others joined us, one by one. Men who had lost everything but not their faith came crawling in with aching knees. Young people searching for something to hold on to when the world seemed to crumble. Elderly people who could barely walk but didn't want to miss that moment. We didn't have complete Bibles. D. King brought a few pages from the Book of Psalms, rescued from his community church, which had been burned down. We passed those pages from hand to hand, as if they were treasures, reading, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Each word seemed to come alive, laden with meaning for all of us. We sang hymns without music, only our whispers intertwined in the night. We prayed for our children, for scattered families, for those we had lost, and for those we still hoped to find again. The darkness around us seemed less heavy because in that instant we felt that God had not forgotten us. And in the midst of that impromptu meeting, something began to change. We were no longer just survivors, victims of circumstance. We were a community of faith, a church without walls, without a pulpit, without anything but our thirst for God. Each nightly meeting strengthened us. We alternated locations so as not to draw attention, but everyone knew where to find us. It was as if an invisible network connected us, threads of hope intertwined in the darkness. But light always attracts shadows. A week after these meetings began, the soldiers discovered what we were doing. It was a damp night, with heavy clouds announcing rain. We were under the tarp of a man named Kosau, singing softly, almost whispering, trying not to attract attention. Then we heard heavy boots approaching. The singing stopped immediately. We stood motionless, praying that they would pass without noticing us. But they didn't. 3 soldiers stormed the tent, tearing it from its stakes, illuminating us with bright flashlights that burned our eyes. They swept the place like accusing spotlights. "What is this?" they shouted in Burmese. "A meeting of Christians." Fear silenced us. The soldier advanced among us, kicking the carpets and trampling the few pages of Psalms we had spread on the floor. He stopped before Kosau, a man bent by the weight of years. "You are the leader, aren't you?" Kosau looked up, and in his eyes there was no defiance, only a deep sadness. "We are just people praying," he said, with a calmness that seemed impossible given the situation. The soldier laughed, a harsh, cruel laugh. "You don't hurt anyone? You're the problem. You and your foreign god." Without warning, he struck Kosau in the face with the butt of his rifle. The impact echoed through the silence of the night. Kosau fell, blood streaming from his nose. The women screamed. I covered my sister with my arms, trying to shield her from the horror. The other 2 soldiers dragged 3 men away from the group, beating them systematically, with a brutality that chilled the soul. "The next time we find them gathered together," the lead soldier said, spitting on the ground, "it won't just be beatings." And then they were gone, leaving us in the darkness, with muffled groans and the metallic taste of fear in our mouths. We ran to the wounded. D. King tore pieces of his own clothing to wipe away the blood. Kosau sat up slowly, touching his broken nose, but his eyes still shone with unbreakable determination. "It's all right," he murmured. "This is what it costs to follow him, and he's worth every blow." His words pierced my heart, but they also brought clarity. I knew I was right, but I also knew I couldn't put my children in this danger any longer. That night, back under the tent, I made a decision. My youngest son snuggled up beside me, pale and trembling. "Mommy, are they coming back?" he asked in a low voice. "Yes," I answered honestly. "And next time, it will be worse." "So, what do we do?" I looked at my 3 children, my eyes landing on each of them, feeling the weight of the responsibility and faith that now bound us together. Quinmu finally fell asleep, exhausted, but recovered. Tita watched me with eyes that seemed to carry years of pain, though they still sought my approval. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm, though heavy with fear. "We'll cross the border and seek refuge in India." "How?" asked Ankiao, his voice trembling. "We have no money. We don't know the way." I took my youngest son's hand and breathed deeply. "The same God who sent that man with the medicine will show us the way." Even as I spoke those words, I felt a pang of doubt. But sometimes faith isn't certainty. Sometimes it's just the courage to take a step when you can't see the ground beneath your feet. The next morning, I went to speak with Dawkin, explaining my plan. "I would do the same if I were younger," he said with a slight, tired smile. "But there is someone who can help you. The missionary who brought the medicine. I heard he knows people who help cross the border into India. Look for him at the north end of the camp." And so, with my heart pounding between hope and terror, I began my search. I asked discreetly, in whispers, following the rumors, each step guided by a silent faith, searching once more for the man who had saved my daughter. It was a miracle. 3 days later, I found him. He was at the northern edge of the camp, where where the tarps gave way to thorny bushes and cracked soil. It wasn't a coincidence. A chain of whispers guided me to him. Each person passed me to the next link with knowing glances, until finally someone pointed to a small bamboo hut covered in black plastic. He was sitting outside, mending a fishing net. When she saw us, me and my 3 children, she looked up and smiled with that same unmistakable look, as if she had been waiting for us all along. Sister Nan said, almost breathless, "We need to get out of here. I've been told you know the way to India." He nodded slowly, dropping the net. "The path is dangerous," he warned. 3 days of walking through the mountains. There are patrols, there are wild animals. At the border, the Indian guards aren't always friendly to the refugees. "I don't care," I replied, surprising myself with the firmness of my voice. "Staying here is waiting to be slowly destroyed. I'd rather risk it all in the mountains." He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. "Right. We leave tomorrow at nightfall. Bring only the essentials. Water, some food, warm clothes, nothing else. Weight is deadly in the mountains." That night, I packed up what little we had. A change of clothes for each child, 2 bottles of water, a handful of rice wrapped in a cloth, and the pages from Doken's Bible that she insisted on giving me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. I couldn't sleep. I lay awake under the tarp, memorizing each of my children's breaths, praying that I was making the right decision. At nightfall the following day, we met at the agreed-upon spot, a shallow ravine north of the camp, hidden by dry bushes, the beginning of a journey that would test our faith to the limit. There were 20 of us, each willing to risk everything for a hope that seemed almost impossible. The missionary divided us into 4 groups. My family stayed with him, and a young childless couple. We went out at 10-minute intervals so as not to arouse suspicion. When it was our turn, the missionary looked at me seriously. "From now on, speak only if absolutely necessary. If you hear patrols, lie down on the ground and don't move. Understood?" I nodded, feeling fear tighten in my stomach. We started walking. The first few kilometers were relatively easy, following a goat trail that snaked between low hills. The crescent moon gave us just enough light to see our footsteps. My Jin was clinging to my back with my shawl, while Tita walked ahead, holding Ankiao's hand. But on the second day, the terrain changed. The hills gave way to mountains, and the trail disappeared, replaced by rocky slopes that seemed to fight against our every step. The air grew so cold that our breath came out in white clouds. My Jin shivered against my back, even with all the clothes we had piled on top of us. Tita stumbled every few steps, scraping her hands on the sharp stones. Though she remained silent, I could see her jaw clenching with each step. At noon, the sound of helicopters broke the silence, first a distant hum, then a roar that made the air vibrate. The missionary made frantic signs. "Get down!" We threw ourselves behind some large rocks, pressing ourselves against the cold stone. The helicopter passed so low that I felt the wind from the rotors hit my face. My heart raced, and for a moment I thought he could hear every beat. Kinem started to cry. I covered his mouth with my hand, hating having to silence him. The helicopter flew past twice and then began to descend toward a nearby valley. Amplified voices shouted orders in Burmese. "They found the other group," the missionary whispered. "We have to go now." We ran in the opposite direction, climbing the mountainside with a desperation that seemed to give us superhuman strength. Behind us, the screams continued, and soon came shots fired into the air. I didn't look back. I kept climbing, feeling my own heavy body against my Jin's, Tita panting beside me, and Ankiao holding my arm when my legs threatened to give way. We walked for hours. As the sun began to set, the missionary led us to a shallow cave where we could rest for only 2 hours. I collapsed onto the cold ground, feeling the weight of everything we had endured. Tita snuggled against me, crying silently. "How much longer?" I asked in a hoarse voice. The missionary gazed at the horizon, where the mountains silhouetted the darkened sky. "If we reach that ridge," he said, pointing to a distant peak, "we'll be on the border. Then, another hour to Mizoram." When night fell, we resumed our march. My legs were pillars of pure pain, but each step was also a step of faith, because up ahead, there was hope, and God was with us, even in the shadows of the mountains. Each step was an act of pure willpower. Even so, my mind always returned to Ko'in Maung, to his sacrifice. I couldn't fail. I couldn't. We reached the summit just before dawn, and for the first time in weeks, my eyes filled with tears. Down below, in the valley, faint lights flickered, small sparks of hope, an Indian village. "India," whispered the missionary. We made it. We descended the mountain with extreme caution. When we reached the road marking the border, he made us wait, hidden among dry bushes. 2 Indian guards patrolled, rifles in hand. "When I tell you," said the missionary, his voice low and firm, "run towards that small building. It's the refugee post. Once there, they can't legally stop us from entering." We waited, our hearts pounding so fast they felt like they would burst. And then, with a signal, we ran. Each step was an effort that ached in our muscles, but nothing hurt more than the fear of being captured. I crossed the invisible line that separated our homeland from India, and something inside me broke and healed at the same time. A guard saw us and shouted, but we were already at the gate of the post, banging and begging to get in. The door opened. A woman wearing a vest from a humanitarian organization looked at us with tired but compassionate eyes. "Go ahead. You are safe now." I fell to my knees on the threshold, my 3 children collapsing around me, and I cried until there were no more tears. We had made it through. Mizoram greeted us with rain, not the violent monsoon that devastates crops, but a gentle, almost maternal rain, washing weeks of dust from our skin. We settled in a refugee camp on the outskirts of Owl, the capital. It was different from the camp in Calais. There were functional latrines, potable water gushing from rusty but reliable taps, and tents with waterproof tarpaulins. More importantly, there was something invisible but profound. There was no constant fear of soldiers patrolling with rifles, no apprehension of night attacks. We could finally breathe. The first few days were about survival. We registered with the authorities, received rations, and found a place to sleep. But Kiao, Tita, and Kin Mio adapted with the strange resilience of children who have already seen too much. They played with other refugee children, inventing toys with cans and string, laughing as if they were normal. I, however, didn't know how to live without fear. Every noise made me tremble. Every vehicle near the camp made me huddle my children against me. At night, I would wake up sweating, startled by the ghostly echo of boots on the doors. Khoten Maung's face appeared in every shadow, his voice in the wind reminding me that I would never see him again. The pain of his absence was a wound that wouldn't heal. Even during the simplest tasks, like washing clothes or peeling vegetables, I would stop and cry without warning, uncontrollably. But despite the fear, despite the pain, we were alive. And no matter how much the past haunted us, there was something inside me that knew God brought us this far, and He would continue to be with us, even in the shadows of memory. My children would find me like that, immersed in silence and tears, and, without needing words, they would come and snuggle into my arms. One afternoon, my mother looked at me with those tired eyes, but full of truth, and said, "You saved us. Dad would be so proud of you." And I didn't feel like a savior. I felt more like a broken piece of someone who had once been whole. The small Christian church in Isal welcomed us with open arms. Every Sunday, they came to the camp bringing food, clothes, but above all, community. It was there that I met Sister Ruth, a woman from Mizoram in her 60s, who had dedicated her whole life to serving refugees. One day she sat beside me and said, "I know what you carry inside. That weight on your chest, as if you were carrying mountains. You don't have to carry it alone." "How?" I asked, my voice breaking. "How do I stop feeling like I should have done more?" She looked at me tenderly and replied, "It's not about stopping feeling, but about allowing God to transform that pain into purpose. Your husband gave his life so that you could live. Now, live in a way that honors that sacrifice." Her words fell upon me like seeds on fertile ground. I started attending the church's prayer meetings for refugees. At first, I could barely speak. I just listened, absorbing every word. But little by little, my voice returned, and with it came something else, the courage to testify. One night, before a circle of refugee women, I told my story for the first time. I spoke about Tambo, Khoten Maung, about the escape through the jungle, Kin Mio's fever that almost took her life, and about the man who crossed checkpoints with medicine hidden in rice. I can only call that a miracle. As I spoke, tears streamed down my face unbidden. Some women wept with me, others nodded, recognizing their own stories of survival. Some simply clung to my words like a lifeline. After that night, people began to seek me out, not because I had answers, but because I had survived. And sometimes, the survival of one becomes the hope of many. Months later, when the camp set up a small school for refugee children, I volunteered. I taught the alphabet to children who had seen villages burn, who had lost parents, siblings, homes. But I taught something even more important, that it was possible to laugh again. Kin Mio, my little butterfly who almost left us, now ran between the tents with an energy that defied everything we had been through. Tita helped the younger girls, like Aunia, and worked with the men in the camp, becoming the person her father had hoped she would be. One afternoon, while I was watching my children playing in the sun, Sister Ruth sat down beside me. She pointed to them and said, "Do you see this? This is resurrection. They didn't just survive. They are truly alive." And in that moment, I realized that even in the midst of the deepest pain, God fulfills His promise of life, hope, and transformation. I hadn't just survived, I was living, and through me, others were finding the strength to go on. She was right. We had lost our land. We had lost Kotenmong. We had lost the life we knew. But amidst so much loss, something remained intact, a faith that had been tested by fire, and that now shone brighter than ever. Sometimes, because of that faith, we are able to see beyond what human eyes allow. At night, I would take the crumpled pages of the Bible that Da Kin had given me and read softly to my children, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Now those words had a different weight, because God did not abandon us in the hut, did not abandon us in the jungle, did not abandon us when Kinmio was burning with fever, and would not abandon us here, in foreign lands. We were broken, yes, but in the cracks of our fragility, God's light entered in ways that no one could imagine. My mission became clear: to tell our story, not to glorify suffering, but to show that even in the midst of pain, God remains sovereign. That nameless missionary taught me something I will never forget. God uses us in our fragility. And I, Nanda Tambo, a refugee in a land that was not mine, discovered that I had a greater purpose than simply surviving. My purpose was to witness, to be a voice, and to be hope. Looking back, I see that nothing happened by chance. It wasn't a coincidence that the missionary passed through 3 checkpoints without being stopped. It wasn't luck that he was carrying exactly the medicine my daughter needed, hidden in a bag of rice. It wasn't mere chance that he arrived exactly when I had no strength left, when my prayers seemed no longer to reach heaven. It was God. God seeing a desperate mother, hearing the whispers of faith from women with nothing but hope, moving invisible pieces on a chessboard that only He could see. That miracle reminded us of what suffering tries to make us forget. We are not alone. There is an invisible hand guiding us even through the darkest valleys, even when the world hates us, even when we lose everything. God never abandons us, not even when we are torn from the people we love in the middle of the night. He is always present. Sometimes He sends angels with human faces who cross impossible borders. Sometimes He carries us when we can no longer walk. And sometimes He transforms our deepest wounds into testimonies that heal others. Today, I live in Mizoram with other Christians who also fled. We share stories, food, and faith. My children are growing up in a land that is not ours, but which has welcomed us with open arms. Kiao dreams of studying medicine, inspired by the man who saved his sister. Tita sings in the church choir, her voice full of joy, as if the war had never tried to steal her music. And my little Kin, my butterfly, runs among the tents, chasing dragonflies, alive against all odds. And I know, with absolute certainty, that God has been with us every step of the way on this journey. He continues to be with us, and He still writes miracles in the lives of those who believe. Sometimes I think of my village, of the rice paddies that shone like green mirrors under the sun, of the bamboo hut where we gathered on Sundays, and, of course, of Kotin Maung. His serene smile still shines through all that we have lost, through all the pain we carry. God knows it hurts. But I also know that what we have gained outweighs what we have lost. We have gained a faith that neither war, nor fear, nor pain could destroy. A faith refined in the most intense fire and emerged like pure gold. This faith is now my mission, to share it with whoever needs it. Because I know that, at this very moment, there is another mother pleading for the life of her sick child. There is another family fleeing in the dead of night. There is someone feeling that God has forgotten them. And I want you to know what I have learned. He does not forget. Never. Even when everything seems lost, even when our prayers seem to fall on deaf ears, He continues working, silently, moving mountains. If this story touched your heart, know that there is someone who needs to hear it today. Perhaps a friend losing hope, perhaps a family member facing their own storm. Share this story. It's not just about sharing words. It's about bringing hope. It's about telling someone that God still performs miracles, that He still intervenes, that He still cares. May this video serve as a reminder to pray for someone today, because miracles begin like this, with a prayer, with a faith that refuses to fade, with people who believe that God still moves the impossible. Thank you for staying until the end. May the God who sent a missionary in the middle of the night, who shut the mouths of lions, who parted the Red Sea, be with you in your own valley, guiding your steps, opening doors, and bringing miracles when you need them most. When you feel lost or alone, remember, He is faithful. He always has been, and He always will be, and you are never alone.